Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink or AI. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to discuss something I've noticed over the years that I don't hear talked about very often. You're standing in front of a piece that is, by every visible measure, excellent. The painting is flawless. The construction is precise. The scene has all the right elements, maybe even a story to tell. Nothing feels unintentional or out of place. And yet, despite all of that, the work never quite engages you. I've had that experience at shows more than once where a truly masterful piece just didn't stay in my mind like something emotionally resonant, even if it wasn't as skillfully finished. The issue isn't quality. The work is clearly the result of skill, time, and careful decision-making. But the longer you look at it, the more you realize that nothing is happening between you and the piece. There's no pull. Nothing draws you in. No feeling that you've stepped into a moment. It feels finished in a way that doesn't extend beyond the object. Nothing lingers after you look away. That feeling can be uncomfortable to acknowledge, especially in a hobby that values mastery and polish. We're not always encouraged to talk about the difference between technical excellence and emotional presence. If something is done well, we tend to assume it should move us. And when it doesn't, the impulse is often to blame ourselves as viewers. Maybe we're missing something. Maybe we don't know enough. Maybe we're standing in the wrong place or looking for the wrong thing. But I don't think that disconnect is always a failure of viewing. I think it's pointing to something real about how certain kinds of finish and certainty can close a work in on itself. Some miniatures feel less like moments you're invited into and more like answers that have already been fully decided. Nothing feels provisional anymore. It's all been nailed down, and there's nothing left for the viewer to do except acknowledge the accomplishment and move on. That's the experience I want to look at more closely, not as a critique of skill and not as a judgment about what miniature work should be, but as a way of naming a shared experience, the strange sense that something can be perfect and still feel dead to the viewer. When I use the word dead here, I want to be very clear about what I mean and what I don't mean. I'm not talking about work that lacks skill or care or effort. I'm not talking about rushed pieces or unfinished ideas or learning stage work. In fact, the kind of work I'm describing often sits at the opposite end of that spectrum. It's controlled, it's confident, it's impeccably resolved. What feels dead in this sense isn't the object itself, but the experience of encountering it. The work doesn't give much back. You can admire it, recognize the accomplishment, respect it, but there's no sense of exchange. The longer you look, the more fixed it feels. I think part of that has to do with how completely the scene has been decided in advance. Everything has been placed with intention. Surfaces are refined. Every gesture has been clarified. There's no ambiguity about what you're meant to see or understand. And because of that, maybe for some viewers, there's no room left to participate in the meaning of the piece. You're not discovering anything, you're confirming what's already been locked in. This kind of closure can feel very different from stillness or restraint. A miniature can feel alive even when it's understated. A minimal scene can feel charged. What makes the difference isn't how much is shown, but whether the work allows for time. Time to wonder, time to imagine what came before the moment you're seeing, or what might follow after. When all of that has been resolved out of the work, the scene can feel strangely timeless, not in a poetic sense, but in a static one. And this is where the discomfort can often come in, because we tend to reward clarity, control, and completeness. Those are visible achievements. They're easy to recognize and praise. Emotional presence is harder to name and easier to miss. It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes you only notice it when it's missing. And when it is missing, what you're left with can feel like a beautifully finished object that has already said everything it has to say. That's what I mean by dead. Not a failure, not a flaw, but a kind of finality that closes the door rather than leaving it slightly ajar for the viewer. One of the most common ways a miniature loses its sense of life is through something that's usually praised: resolution. We're taught to resolve things, to clean them up, to make sure the story is clear, to eliminate confusion. And all of that matters up to a point. But there's a moment where resolution stops helping and starts closing the door. You can feel that moment when you encounter a piece and understand it almost immediately. You understand what's happening. The roles are clear. The reason for the scene is already decided. Nothing feels unclear and nothing feels unfinished. And at first, that can be satisfying. There's a sense of competence there, a sense of mastery. But that satisfaction tends to be brief. Once the scene is fully understood, there's nowhere else to go. Research in aesthetics and perception shows that people tend to stay engaged longest when there's some degree of uncertainty left in the work. Not confusion, but uncertainty. A sense that there's more than one way to understand what you're seeing. When everything is resolved too cleanly, attention can drop. The viewer's mind has nothing left to work on. There's no small puzzle, no unanswered question, no tension to hold on to. This is often when looking turns into scanning. Instead of entering the scene, the viewer starts moving across the surface. You notice the blends, the textures, the technical decisions. You might admire them and be impressed by them, but you're no longer inside the moment the miniature is trying to evoke. You're standing outside of it, evaluating how well it's been constructed. Studies on visual ambiguity show that when a work requires the viewer to participate in meaning making, engagement deepens. When everything resolves cleanly into a single reading, the viewer shifts from participation into inspection. And this shift isn't a failure on the viewer's part. It's a predictable response when a work leaves no room for participation. When every element points to the same fixed conclusion, the viewer's role becomes passive more than active. You're not discovering anything. You're confirming what's already been decided. The miniature becomes an answer rather than a question. What makes this especially tricky is that over-resolution doesn't usually feel like a mistake, especially while you're making the piece. It often feels responsible. You're fixing things, tightening things, making sure nothing is confusing or unresolved. From the inside, it can feel like progress. I've done this. I've overworked something that ended up having more life in it before I kept trying to resolve everything. There's often a moment at the bench when you realize you're no longer responding to what the work is doing, but to what you think it should already be. You stop asking small, local questions and start enforcing consistency. You refine because refinement feels safer than uncertainty. You clean up not because something is wrong, but because leaving it open feels uncomfortable. This is usually when the work starts to harden, not visually, but conceptually. Decisions stop being provisional. Everything begins to point in the same direction. And once that happens, it becomes much harder to hear when the piece is asking for something different. From the maker's side, this can feel like control slipping away unless you double down. From the viewer's side, it often reads as a scene that knows exactly what it is and has already said everything it has to say. That gap between how finished the work feels to make and how closed it feels to encounter is one of the hardest things to notice while you're working inside it. What's important here is that detail and openness are not opposites. A piece can be dense, complex, and highly finished and still feel alive if that detail supports multiple readings. The shift happens when all of that complexity funnels toward a single locked interpretation. Everything reinforces everything else. Nothing resists. Nothing pushes back. At that point, resolution doesn't deepen the scene. It can flatten it. The miniature becomes complete in the most final sense of the word. There's nothing left to linger on. And that's often the moment when a piece starts to feel technically impressive, but emotionally inert. There's also another layer to this that's a little harder to talk about because it has less to do with technique and more to do with vulnerability. Sometimes finish doesn't just clarify a piece, it protects it. When every surface is polished, every decision controlled, and every meaning clarified, the work can start to function like armor, both for the work and for the person who made it. Finished work is easy to stand behind. It's visible. It's defensible. Smooth blends and precise edges send a clear signal. This piece is competent. It's resolved. It knows what it's doing. Aesthetics research describes something called psychological distance, the space that allows emotional engagement. When finish and control push that distance too far, the viewer stops inhabiting the scene and starts judging it instead. The work becomes something to assess, not something to enter. In a hobby where work is often evaluated publicly, sometimes through comparison, sometimes against formal standards, that signal can really matter. Finish becomes a safe place to stand if everything looks intentional and complete. It's harder to challenge. The work can be admired without asking anything uncomfortable of the viewer and without exposing anything uncertain or unresolved from the maker. That kind of control can be genuinely reassuring. It signals seriousness, it signals mastery, and in an environment where judgment is explicit or implied, it can feel necessary. It's also worth saying that finish often begins as an act of generosity, wanting a piece to read clearly, wanting viewers to understand what they're looking at, wanting to present the work with care and respect. None of that is wrong, and in many cases, it's thoughtful and considerate. The shift happens gradually when finish stops being about clarity and starts becoming about self-protection. When polish takes over not because the piece needs it, but because uncertainty feels exposed, at that point, finish starts doing more than describing the work. It starts guarding it. That's the moment when refinement stops serving the scene and starts stabilizing the maker. And that's not a failing, it's a human response to risk. But it can change how the work is perceived once it leaves the maker. Over time, this pressure can subtly reshape how work gets made. Clarity starts to feel synonymous with success. Ambiguity begins to feel too risky. Leaving something unresolved can start to feel like a mistake rather than a choice. So the work becomes increasingly controlled, increasingly refined, increasingly sealed off. Every edge is resolved, every gesture is clarified. Nothing is left open that could possibly be questioned. This isn't about intention. Most people aren't consciously using finish as protection. It emerges naturally in a culture that equates mastery with certainty. The armor does its job. The piece stands complete and intact. But when finish starts doing the emotional work of the piece, when polish replaces presence, something subtle shifts. The work stops reaching outward and starts holding itself together. You can sometimes feel this in how close a piece lets you get. Some miniatures invite you in slowly. They reward extended looking. They seem to change the longer you stay with them. Others feel as though you're meant to stand at a respectful distance. You can observe them, but you remain on the outside. The surfaces can be immaculate, the gestures are precise, and everything is already decided. It doesn't feel like a moment, it feels like a display. The miniature remains impressive, but it becomes distant. And that distance is often what people are responding to when they say a piece feels technically perfect and still somehow lifeless. The armor has done its job. The work is intact, unchallenged, complete. But the cost of that protection is often a loss of openness, a loss of the small places where a viewer might otherwise project themselves into the scene. When finish functions as armor, the miniature becomes something to look at rather than giving the viewer something to connect with. Another way to understand why some miniatures feel dead is to pay attention to how they handle time. Alive scenes tend to imply time. Dead ones often cancel it out. Research in visual storytelling and narrative perception suggests that people engage more deeply with scenes that suggest a before and an after. When a miniature feels alive, it often carries the sense that something has just happened or is about to happen. The moment feels suspended rather than frozen. You're not just seeing a scene, you're meeting it at a specific moment in time. Lifeless miniatures, by contrast, often feel outside of time. Everything is perfectly posed. Every gesture is fully explained. There's no unresolved action, no tension, no sense of transition. The piece reads like a still image that exists only to be looked at. not a moment embedded in a larger flow. It feels less like a slice of lived experience and more like a demonstration. This is especially common when realism is pushed to extremes without corresponding narrative cues. Hyper-finished surfaces, precise lighting, and flawless textures can create the impression of realism while gradually stripping away temporal life. The scene becomes static in a way that doesn't invite imagination. Nothing seems to have led up to this moment, and nothing seems likely to follow. When time disappears from a miniature, so does much of the viewer's emotional access. There's no place to project memory, anticipation, or consequence. The work becomes complete in the present tense only. It exists as an eternal now, but never unfolds. And without that sense of unfolding, the scene can feel inert, no matter how beautifully it's made. A live work doesn't need overt drama to suggest time. Sometimes it's as simple as a gesture that isn't fully resolved, or an environment that looks used rather than displayed. Those small cues allow the viewer to imagine motion, history, and possibility. When they're absent, the miniature may remain technically flawless, but emotionally still. One of the things that becomes clear when you start paying attention to this is that perfection and presence aren't the same thing. They can overlap, but they don't guarantee each other. A piece can be meticulously finished and still feel distant. Another can be visibly imperfect and feel charged with life. What separates them isn't polish. It's whether the work feels open to encounter by the viewer. One way to notice the difference is to pay attention to how a piece behaves over repeated encounters. Some miniatures make a strong first impression and then fade quickly. You see everything there is to see almost at once. The experience is complete in a single pass. Others don't announce themselves. They unfold slowly. The first time you see them, they might feel understated. The second or third time, something starts to surface. A relationship between elements, a tension you didn't notice before, a sense of time passing through the scene. Presence tends to deepen with attention. Perfection often exhausts itself more quickly. That doesn't make perfection wrong. It just means it operates differently. One rewards recognition, the other rewards return. From an information theory perspective, perfectly predictable surfaces actually reduce emotional response. Once the brain resolves everything immediately, the experience ends. Presence lasts longer because it keeps meaning in motion. Presence has less to do with how much control a piece displays and more to do with how much time it seems to hold. When a miniature feels alive, there's often a sense of motion or consequence, even if nothing dramatic is happening. The scene doesn't explain itself fully. It offers a situation rather than a conclusion. You're not being told what to think. You're being given room to arrive there on your own. This kind of openness doesn't require roughness or looseness. It can exist in highly refined work, but it usually shows up where the maker has resisted the urge to resolve everything, where something remains slightly indeterminate, a gesture that isn't fully spelled out, a space that suggests use rather than display, a moment that feels paused rather than frozen. When presence is there, viewers tend to slow down. They stop scanning for detail and start inhabiting the scene. Their attention shifts from evaluation to engagement. And that shift doesn't come from novelty or complexity. It comes from a sort of permission, the sense that the work isn't complete without the viewer's participation. Perfection, on the other hand, often asks for acknowledgement rather than involvement. It invites admiration, then moves on. Presence lingers. It doesn't announce itself. You notice it in how long you stay and how the piece continues to work on you after you've stepped away. That distinction is significant, especially when there is often so much emphasis on finish and mastery. The goal of a miniature isn't just to demonstrate control. It's also to create an encounter. If everything's already been decided, there's nothing left for you to do but view the work, acknowledge it, and move on. It doesn't really stay with you after you move on. This is really hard to talk about precisely because there's no clean rule for it. I think part of what makes this topic uncomfortable is that it doesn't offer an easy takeaway. There isn't a checklist for presence or a clear line where a piece crosses from alive to lifeless. That boundary is felt rather than defined. You only really notice it when you're standing in front of a work and realizing how much or how little it asks of you. Miniatures don't need to explain themselves to be meaningful. In fact, some of the most compelling work I've encountered is work that resists explanation. It leaves things unsaid. It trusts the viewer to bring their own time, memory, and attention into the space the piece creates. That kind of trust can be hard to allow, especially when clarity and completion are frequently rewarded. When a miniature leaves room instead of sealing itself shut with finish or certainty, it has the chance to breathe. The scene doesn't end at the edge of the base. It extends outward into the imagination of whoever is looking. And that extension is where presence often exists. So if a technically perfect piece ever feels strangely distant to you, that reaction doesn't mean you've failed to understand it. It may simply mean that the work has already said everything it has to say. And sometimes the pieces that stay with us the longest are the ones that stop just short of that. The ones that remain open enough to meet us where we are. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, not obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.